Welcome back to the Men of Issachar Podcast. We have a very special episode that's been in the works for a while now. I think we've had to reschedule this particular session around 4 or 5 times due to either illness or everyone's schedules just not being able to match up. Nick, Duncan, and Christie Wright are our guests today, and we're going to be talking about classical Christian education, or CCE, as you might hear it referred to, and why it is superior to other types of education in most cases. I know that's a bold claim, but there's a study that Christie quotes in this episode that kind of backs up that claim. So I encourage you to listen all the way through. Both Nick and Christie are 1% of 1%ers in my book. Not only are they brilliant in many different subjects, they are truly kind and good people and have a ton of experience and just wisdom to bring to the subject. So sit back, relax, as Terry Gant, Jeff Wright, and myself, Jason Gaw, strive to be men of Issachar.
Welcome back to the Men of Issachar Podcast, the podcast where we seek to be like the Men of Issachar, to know the times and to know what to do. If you listened to our last podcast, we had on our guest Joshua Abatoy to speak about elite education, secondary education, higher education, I guess. And so today we're going to go back to a more foundational approach, and we have a couple of guests with us today. So I'm here with our usual host, Jeff Wright, back with us after a lengthy battle with a near terminal case of the flu. Jason Gaw, of course, back with us. I'm here as well, Terry Gant, and we're back with Nick, Duncan, and Christie Wright. Christie is the academic dean of a classical Christian K through 12 school, and Nick is development. What is your title?
Development director.
Development director of a different K through 12 classical school. And so, and I am also in administration in classical schools. So we've got a couple of folks here who, we all have at least one foot in classical, either with being a parent or being a teacher, former teacher, whatever. So this bunch is going to discuss classical education, I think, today. So,
hey, can we get on the record, I guess, Chris, you first. How many years in classical?
This is my 19th year.
Okay, founded 2 schools.
Yep, so far.
Nick, how many years particularly were you a headmaster?
10.
10 years. Yeah. And then taught before that for?
3 years before that, and so 14 or 15 years total at this point in CC.
A couple decades in the room.
All right. Well, let's see. I guess the question, probably the big question to kick us off with, and this is kind of the point of the episode, is what is classical education? What is it that makes it different? So anybody want to take a stab at that in a succinct way?
Yes.
Okay, do it.
All right. Classical Christian education, we fondly call it the new old way because it is new in a sense to a lot of us, especially in America, this generation particularly. The modern movement started in the late 70s, early 80s. Most of the oldest classical Christian schools started in a span between like 78 and 82. And so we call it new because that's not very old. But we call it the old way because the movement is a recovering and a discovery of a way of educating that itself is incredibly old. It's the way that people in the West were educated beginning in the ancient world, all the way back to Athens. Of course, it's looked different in the West, even in different seasons, in different ages. But all the way back to Athens and the first academies, the gymnasiums, all the way up to the late, in America, all the way up to the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's about a 40-year stretch, the progressive era from about 1880 to 1920. When you have the rise of John Dewey and others who began what we call like the progressive movement, what we call modern education, secular education, where they began kind of deconstructing the old way of educating and reforming it into what we would commonly call job training, preparing people for the workforce over and above educating. And so the difference is that education is really a passing on of a way of life, I think most simply is how you would put it. In Ephesians, when Paul says to fathers particularly to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, one of the words that we translate there doesn't actually have a very good English translation. So the Greek word is paideia, and we don't really have a nurture and admonition doesn't really do it justice. So paideia is like a passing on of a way of life. It's an enculturation. It is what God's people of old would have thought of when the Lord told them in Deuteronomy to teach their children by writing it on the doorposts of their house, on the frontlets of their eyes. It's Psalm 1. You know, when you rise up, when you walk, like at all times. This is an immersive, for all my Baptist friends in the room, this is an immersive way of doing life. It is a passing on of a way of life, and particularly after the time of Christ, this type of education became distinctly Christian. And so for the majority of its time, it's been Christian. And so that is what kind of Western education has been. And then we call it classical education because it's old and we're recovering it. And we call it classical Christian education because it should be centered in Christ. Because you'll hear us use words like truth, goodness, and beauty. Those are the transcendentals that the medievals would speak of. And everything that you could know that was worth knowing was true and good and beautiful. And that Christ is the standard and the root for those things. And so there's a lot more to it that I'm sure everybody here could add on to, but that's kind of in a nutshell what it is. And so, and it doesn't change. You can find different flavors of it, but our discovery of it changes as we continue to read medieval writers and ancient writers. And we're still in that process. We want our students and we want our own children to be lifelong learners. And so we should be lifelong learners. So we want to keep reading these people and trying to improve upon it by recovering more and more of the gold and making it even better. So that's what we're in the project of doing. That's our project.
Okay. So we can probably unpack a few key terms, right? Like the term classical, if you're familiar with it, is a reference to a Greco-Roman culture, right? That's what it really means in its narrow sense. It has to do with Greece and Rome. Mm-hmm. And that is a big component of what classical does, right? There's a lot of, I'm going to use this term, pedagogy. Pedagogy, to put simply, is just teaching method. Like what are the strategies the teachers employ in the classroom to actually instruct? So we derive a lot of pedagogical strategies from Greeks, your Socratic question and answer dialogue, and that was and still is a very common way to educate certain specific classes. So lawyers, for instance, are still educated that way, even in a modern university that has nothing to do with classical. So this is not something that's completely vanished from the earth, but K through 12 classical schools see these teaching methods as they align with the children's development. They make sense to the kid. And you kind of ride with the grain of the student's developing brain by applying pedagogical techniques that enable them to learn well and in a way that's interesting to them, in addition to the content that we actually teach. So if I had to say that there was two differences, so the idea of an elevator pitch, right? And that was a pretty good one. If I was just talking to somebody who just asked me what is the thing that's different about classical, I would say, well, there's two things that most people would commonly understand. And one is curriculum, so the actual content of what is in the classes. And the other one is the pedagogy. So the pedagogy, like I said, is just the teaching methods. And this is, of course, oversimplified, but again, elevator pitch. And so the methods that we teach are borrowed from the old way of teaching, the old way of learning, the old way of understanding human development. And, it's important to point out that this isn't good because it's old. It's good because we can look back on paragons and see that they were well educated. I often find myself looking back to like the American founders and thinking, how were they educated? And it was with these methods and with this content. And so the curriculum side is There's certain specific academic disciplines that all classical schools ought to have, but it's based on the liberal arts. So, Mrs. Wright, would you like to unpack the liberal arts for us?
Before I do, I'd like to add, I think a brief, succinct way to think about classical education is that you want to help children understand the answers to 3 questions. First, who am I? And just, if you let that sink in, that's not you don't answer that with rote memory, right? Who am I? And all that you have to learn and unpack to answer that question well. How did I get here? Again, thinking about that culturally. Okay, I'm Christian, I'm Western. Who is my family? What does it mean to be, living in the postmodern world? And then all that you have to learn to have a full answer to that question: who am I? How did I get here? And what am I made for? What is my telos or my end? Where am I headed? And I think that's another easy way to help. It doesn't get into the details, which we can into liberal arts education, but it doesn't quite get into the details of the curriculum. But you can imagine, well, what are all of the things I need to learn if I want to answer those 3 questions, and how much time it would take to be able to do that well.
Well, and just because we're setting up contrast and things too. So Nick already talked about progressive education. Think about the richness of those questions versus how will I earn a substantial living, which is sort of or how do I integrate into the economy, which is sort of
how do I go to college? Yeah,
that's the highest aspiration of the progressive education. We're talking about something that's just categorically different.
Yeah, it really is drastically different. But Terry, to go back to your question about the 7 liberal arts, so we're talking about 7 disciplines. We're going to organize them into 3 and 4. We'll start with the 3, the trivium. These are language-based arts, and they're all you had referenced in keeping with the grain of children. I think that is really helpful, but is secondary. Mm-hmm. So when we think about them just in terms of content and disciplines, we're talking about grammar, which we define as the basic component parts of every subject. So we would say that English has a grammar, but also science has a grammar, mathematics has a grammar, that theology has a grammar. So everything has a grammar to it, understanding the basic component parts. And then we go to logic or dialectic, understanding how do those parts interact with each other. What kind of systems do I need to understand language, science, history? This is where we're talking about things like hermeneutics, right? How do I understand how literature works today? I taught middle schoolers about the hero's journey. That is very appropriate for the logic level, because we need to understand how does literature work. And then we get to the third aspect of the trivium, which is rhetoric. And so in rhetoric, we're understanding what are all of these things I've learned for? What do I aim them at? How do I communicate about them in an educated and wise way, and then also in a winsome way, so that if I've learned to understand what is good and true and beautiful, which is sort of undergirds these, I also understand I have the impetus to bring people along with me, right? So I don't learn these things for my own sake, not just to get into college, but the goal is to understand what is good as a distinction from what is evil or just unhelpful. And then necessarily I need to be bringing people along with me. So that's the trivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric. We can talk about these more, but just to get the other,
and these are all these exist as independent, like academic disciplines in their own right. We obviously teach students rhetoric in the sense that it's I meant to say grammar, but rhetoric too. We teach grammar in the sense that like they're learning parts of speech. It's like what you would think of as grammar. Right. So it is a class as well, but it's
logic
also
and rhetoric as well.
It's also a category, and so we kind of does double duty in that sense.
Right. So we're talking about a curriculum. Let's put kids in grammar class, put kids in a logic class, which we do, put kids in a rhetoric class, which we do. But I like to think of it as well as an epistemological framework. So how do I understand any discipline? How do I gain knowledge? So if I look at anatomy and physiology, which is not my field, I probably should have picked something I knew more about, but I need to start by understanding I'm building knowledge. How do I understand anatomy and physiology at a grammar level? What are the basic component parts? There's a lot of memory involved. We have to know the names of things, right? And we can think about, we could talk a lot about naming and the theological implications with naming having authority and mastery and understanding something well. But then I need to know, how do the systems of the body work? And then what is the body for, and how do I communicate that? What are all the reasons I would need to communicate that? And that's just one discipline. So we're attacking everything with the trivium, but the trivium is also in and of itself 3 different, content areas. I don't know if we want to keep talking about the trivium or if I should go on.
No, you can move on. I just wanted to point that out that it can mean both. So context is key.
Yeah, it should be. You say it can be. I think it necessarily should be.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. What I mean is, like, in conversation, it could be either of those things. So you got to pay attention to what specifically.
And that doesn't even get to Dorothy Sayers' understanding. Well, I wouldn't say that that's her full understanding of the trivium. It's just what she puts out in an essay. She gives a speech, I believe, in 1947. If anybody wants to correct me on that, she gives a speech to the graduating class. Again, check my details, but a graduating class of teachers at Oxford in 47. And she says, no one will ever listen to me, but here are some thoughts I have about education. And so she puts the trivium back out on the table, and she says, look around you. Are we impressed with what we're seeing from our educated class? It's excellent, by the way, for her to have written this so long ago. It's pretty jarring.
It's available for free if you just Google it. Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning.
That's right.
And you'll find it, and it's not very long. So if this is an interesting topic to you, look that up and you'll find it pretty easily.
Yeah. So she is really responsible for the spark of the recovery that Nick was mentioning earlier. And she talks about the trivium in a third way that I think is really very excellent, but I also think is really secondary. So she talks about it in terms of the developmental stages of children. And so children are poll parrots in the grammar stage. They want to repeat. This is where we get our chanting and our reciting, and we can do it again and do it again and do it again because we know the 6-year-old does not grow tired.
Their brains are good at memorizing large volumes of grammar, essentially, right?
And then, I know in teacher school, they really downplayed or really condemned rote memory. They would say, drill and kill, don't drill and kill. Nick, I don't know if you heard this in teacher school too, but they would say, don't drill and kill. But then what we have is a class of a society of people, everybody has really strong opinions, but not a lot of factual basis for those opinions because they didn't learn the grammar of whatever they're talking about. And so, strong opinions in politics, but you say, well, who ran for your state Senate?
Or define this thing that you hate, and they often can't. Those
Absolutely,
kinds of
yeah. So defining is really important. It's part of the grammar stage, again, necessary. And this is really important for small children. So Dorothy Sayers said the poll parrot stage. And then she... in the logic stage, again, she's kind of looking at middle-aged children, middle grades children, middle school age children. And she called them the PERT, I believe. Am I remembering that correctly?
Stage, PERT. I think that's right.
And if anyone's spent time with a 13-year-old, they know that you cannot tell them anything that is true without them questioning that. And that's, probably a little bit of a social thing. I think it's in the nature of a child to start to question and say, I need to understand more than just taking that at face value. I think that's good. What they're saying is, can I see what's behind the curtain, please? Can I understand
And that's the
more?
developmental stage where an independent, mature adult is starting to emerge.
Right.
Right. And so it's good for a student to, at some stage, start saying, well, I'm going to have my own thoughts about things.
Agreed. Yeah.
It's just, it's so often kind of like a wildfire.
right. Because they're immature.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I appreciate is that this model anticipates that and channels it.
And what I was referencing, I think people tend to think of middle schoolers as really sassy and sarcastic. That might be more of a social, I hate the phrase social construct, but some things are socially constructed. I don't think they necessarily have to be punks. I think that's probably more social.
They aren't necessarily foolish, though.
They aren't. That's right.
That's the biblical category.
And so the
goal is to become wise.
That's right. And so they're questioning, but they're not always going to do that in a really respectful way. They're not going to do it in a thoughtful way.
Or an effective way.
An effective way. So we want to teach them how to question. What we like to say is they're going to argue anyway. We may as well teach them how to do it well.
Right.
There are rules to
How do you ask the question well? How do you, to elicit information that will help you resolve whatever it is that's
interrogate an idea well.
Right.
Right. So again, if we're looking at Sayers, the way she laid out the trivium, we're talking about how do we teach pedagogically in keeping with the developmental stages of a child. And we look at a child who is foolish, bound up in their hearts, yet straining towards adulthood and independent thinking.
Still bearing the image of God.
it just clashes, and it's just a big knot and a big mess. And so we say, here's what we need. We need structure. We need systems for thought, right? We need to teach you what questions to ask, how to do that. Let you know there are questions to be asked. This is a good thing, right? Pushing against authority, I think, is appropriate within, all the parameters, respect being one of them. And then when they've learned how to do that well, what we see in our older teenagers, here we say rhetoric school is 10th, 11th, and 12th. That's kind of the idea. Schools can define that differently, but we're looking at those older teenagers, and we see that they're anxious to create and
contribute.
Contribute,
is a term
right?
that comes to mind for me.
I don't know that anybody's had an original thought in a really long time, but they like to think that they, they are striving towards original thinking.
Well, you're at the age that they're at. They have accumulated sufficient grammar knowledge, and they have learned to think clearly enough that they now feel that they have contributions to make to whatever academic discipline, whatever social situation they're in, and in many cases they're correct, and so. Now we're at the stage where we're going to teach them how to do that, right?
Right. And
sorry,
so just for clarity, we're talking about moving into the rhetoric stage.
Moving into the rhetoric stage, that's right. So we do need them to contribute, and every contribution is going to require communication.
Yes.
There's no field that says good communication skills are not required here whatsoever. Nobody's going to say that. Not to mention, Nick talked about a way of life, not to mention the fact that communication is necessary to be a good churchman, to be a good wife, to be a good adult child, just thinking about all of the things that are going to be required
of humans,
not just we do this so we can go to college and then we can work and then we can retire. But what does life look like? This is an enculturation.
And our society dissuades communication skills because we have such good communication tools that the skills often lack because of those tools.
Yeah, this is kind of we were just discussing this before. The Zoomers stereotypically aren't very good at phone calls, right? Because they text and email for everything. And so that's a weakness for this generation because they have been allowed to lean on this. And another example, we all used to memorize phone numbers, right? And now nobody remembers anybody's phone number because we just save them. So it's a skill we used to lean on. Now we have a tool that does it for us. And part of the purpose of reaching back in time is to look at what was education good at when it was making Renaissance men and women, and calling those things back up. Even though, sure, AI can write your email or write your speech or whatever. Rhetoric teaches them how to think through it and do it in a superior way.
A way that can actually move the needle. So
sure.
With trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and then quadrivium, what does that do? Get our listeners up on that.
Right. Are you sure we can talk another hour about rhetoric? Right. So that's the 3, trivium, and then we get into the 4. I said the trivium were language-based. I've been talking also for a while. I don't know if anybody wants to.
I'll do the quadrivium. Yeah, how's that? So the quadrivium are our number arts, and they are arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And so that can be explained. This is still a little esoteric, but arithmetic is numbers in sequence. Geometry is numbers in space. Astronomy is time and space, and music is numbers in time, which is fancy sounding. But these are all number arts, and you wouldn't think that when everyone's like, "Do you got STEM education in classical?" And that may be a good deviation because that's going to be a question. And the answer is yes. You teach science and math robustly, and furthermore, why? Why are we studying science and math? One of the points of emphasis is because science is such a vast field. It's not really reasonable to expect any school K through 12 to teach a student to be an expert in any field of science. And so a big important part of it, in addition to learning the grammar of a specific type of science, for instance, you mentioned A&P or anatomy and physiology before, but also teaching them how to be scientists, right? Like, how do you make legitimate scientific inquiry and submit to the truth of your findings and things of that nature? So there's some philosophical components to it as well.
If that doesn't sound relevant, I think most people can harken back to very recent days when we were told the science had a definitive conclusion on a topic, and we should listen to the science.
The science is settled.
You need a sort of person who understands the grammar and the logic of science to go, wait a minute, that's not how that works. So some kind of rhetorical manipulation is taking place here.
Yeah.
Well, really what we want to do in science is we want to organize our thinking. One way to think about classical education is we're teaching children how to have an organized mind and an organized heart. And so science, of course, we want nurses and doctors and math. We need all of that. That's really practical. That stuff is definitely available to students. But I would say more than that is that we need students to learn how to organize their minds, and a study in science helps them to do that with the material world, which they live in. It's necessary. And I don't think, I think it's tempting for Christians. I think there's an old idea that like Christian schools just say, well, we just need the Bible. What else do we need? Just teach the Bible. It's sufficient. It is sufficient for salvation and godly living, true. But the Lord has worked in the material world as well. And I think having a robust understanding of science, learning to love the works of the Lord, not just in the spiritual realm and the immaterial world, but in the material world as well. It's real. Again, it's just thinking, the scientific method is a way to think through a problem. And so even if you're not going to be a scientist, if you're going to be a mother, I just need to think, I need to have an organized mind and know how to think through a problem well. And that applies to anything.
Sure.
So,
a home improvement project, car problem. We're very down earthy issues.
A special needs child.
Even relationship, even things that aren't necessarily STEM subjects. How do I solve the problem in an organized way? And I think, and then also in a precise way. So Nick might speak more to this, but the medievals said you do not get near the theological studies until you have passed certain markers in math and science. And the reason is because theology and the greater things, the transcendental things, require such an ability to practice precision, right? To define well, to think through categories well. And science and math do that for us really, really well. So I like to call math details training class.
Yes. It is a kind of logic class in its own right.
Absolutely.
And the medievals saw philosophy as interrelated to what we would call mathematics, because it's about orderliness, precision, right? So Pythagoras is not just developing a mathematical theorem. He's engaging in philosophy because there's an interconnected in a way that probably he didn't recognize as a pagan. There's an interconnectedness within Christ who is revealed both through special revelation and his natural world. They saw those things as more tightly wedded, that we'd be wise to see as more tightly wedded too, because you're operating on the same, for lack of a better term, operating system that God installed in his creation.
Another thing, to take this in a little bit different but a related direction, is the importance of thinking of those transcendentals. So again, they are truth, goodness, and beauty. Everything that Christie said is right about having an organized mind, and that is a thing that we're seeking within classical Christian education. But when you think about humans being humans having souls, right? So souls are simple. They're one thing, but they have various faculties. So we have a will, and we have a mind, and we have affections. And the way that we educate, if we're passing on a whole way of life, then the liberal arts particularly are about intellectual virtue. So the things that Christie was speaking to. But it's also why we value things like fine arts. You've seen a growing recovery of what we would call mechanical arts, which are fine arts are arts that would produce beauty, and liberal arts produce intellectual virtue, and mechanical arts are producing things that are for just the common good of man. So mechanical arts are very broad, but you can think of like a beekeeper. Someone who is beekeeping is doing a mechanical art, and the outworking of that is honey, right? Which is a good thing.
And those things meet sometimes in like a skilled craftsman with wood.
Yes,
very functional, also very beautiful.
Yep.
Both things are
there's intellect involved there, your affections are involved there because you want to build something that is good, right? You want to build something that is lovely. And of course, you have to use the basic foundations of nature and how the wood works and how the saw will work that cuts it. And you have to use math to measure and to figure out the best way to do the craft, to join things together or to tear some things apart in order to join them to other things.
Well, and then how to
create something
glorify
new.
them, right? You glorify them by joining them well, varnishing, displaying.
So part of all of this education of it not just being just intellectual pursuit is that you don't want to make just very clever devils, right? So we talk about the language of piety a lot. So thinking about what you're made for, that question that Christie raised earlier, Westminster Shorter Catechism question 1 says you're made to glorify God and enjoy him forever, right? So that involves all of those transcendentals that we're speaking about. So I was made by God. Who is he then? And what are my duties to him? So the first 4 commandments are all about that, right? And then the last 6 commandments are all about to our fellow man. So this is Christ saying, love God and love neighbor, right? The very first command of loving neighbor is to honor your father and your mother. So how should inferiors honor superiors, and how should superiors honor inferiors? Like there's hierarchy built into God's world. We all have biological fathers and mothers. We all also live under various local, state, national governments in America that rule us.
The lordship of Christ, preeminent over all things.
Christ is head of the church and also all things. And so hopefully our students are going to be church members, right? So like there's all these various hierarchies that teach us how to relate to other humans in our life. And piety is honoring those institutions and obeying their lawful commands, and not only those that are living, but honoring those that have come before, right? And so this is why we read, by and large, people who have died, right, from ages past, because they have wisdom to offer that we need to glean from, and not just so we can learn what has happened, but like Christie said, know who we are, and it pushes us into the future. It's true conservatism. How do we conserve these things, but not just conserve them for their own sake, conserve them so that we can learn how to glorify God and how we can learn to honor our fathers and our mothers that came before us.
Yeah, so I've been chomping at the bit, listening to you talk. I'll take a little excursus here, but I want to tee you back up on that point. So Christie talked about the kind of human frame approach that classical education represents as secondary. That was for me sort of the hook that set my affections for classical. You think about, again, contrasts are helpful. You think about a progressive educator who takes a child and sees it as an unformed lump with potential for usefulness in an economy. And they begin to shape that lump toward their purposes for it, right? Classical education actually has spent centuries, maybe millennia, studying the human as a creature and figuring out the best ways to bring that creature to its highest expression of the potential that was built within it. And that was what, again, hooked me on this, that it was a human kind of education, where progressive education is much more dehumanizing. It makes cogs for a machine is an easy example, where classical education is trying to raise humans, to elevate and glorify humans. And one of the things that I most appreciate about the tradition as I've learned more of it, and here we're getting closer to the tee up, Nick, is that classical education is largely immune to what C.S. Lewis, or it has been, there's forces that are pushing it in the wrong way, but it's largely been immune to what Lewis called chronological snobbery, which, if you're not familiar with that, listener, it's this idea, it's intellectually unfounded, that because we exist later in history, we have a superior perspective to those who've gone before us. That's chronological snobbery. Classical Christian education, when done right, rejects that. To an episode we did previously on Men of Issachar about conservatives need to conserve something, one of the things we're privileged to know is that in a fallen world, things that are truly true, good, and beautiful are hard to come by, and they must be conserved and handed on and built upon. Well, that's what classical is doing. And so I guess the thing that I most want to tee you up on here, Nick, is this is a fifth commandment education. We talk about honoring our fathers and mothers. We know that's a virtue in Christianity. We know it's a command. We tend to have a limited view of, well, that means I need to be respectful of my dad. I need to do what my mom says when she tells me to go do the chores. But we actually have a fifth commandment understanding that's incredibly expansive. And this tradition takes it to an appropriate Christian end. And so let me just roll that fifth commandment idea to you and let you talk about that further.
Yeah. Well, you did a pretty good job. I'd say we could think about maybe like a practical outworking of what this would look like. So something that a lot of us in this room care about are like generational farms, right? So the way that a classical Christian education and thinking about piety and honoring those who've come before, what making a decision about your family's generational farm would look like versus what progressive education system would have you think about a decision like that. So let's say your great-great-grandfather started this farm and he's got a few hundred acres and generations of your family have worked it. And because you grew up in progressive education and because you've, watched the media tell you that like the economy is the most important thing ever, that GDP, all that matters is like GDP, this is the measure of what makes a nation great, then it would be very easy for you to want to sell that farm because after all, you were raised in what they called education, but what was really job training and teaching you to be a machine in the cog to help you think, how can I make the most amount of money possible to live the best and most fulfilling and happiest life that I can live? And so I'm going to sell the family farm for $50 million, because they're going to subdivide it or they're going to build an AI data center on it. That's a big push now.
I feel like I've walked into a Wendell Berry story at this point.
Well, everyone should read Wendell Berry. Yeah. He thinks in a very classical and Christian way.
As I say, he does actually tell stories to flesh these exact ideas out.
Right,
which I think
he
is
does
really
tell
helpful.
stories to flesh these things out. And so versus someone who went through a classical Christian education, if it did its job, then you would hope that they're thinking about more than just the economics of it, that they know they're not just a cog in the machine, that their most important asset is not just their economic output, but that they also owe honor and respect to the generations that have come before them, and that they would recognize that there's something special, and I would probably even argue sacred, about the dirt that their family has worked for so long. And that would hopefully lead them to a different outcome. And so that the economic factor is not, it's important, but it's not the telos, it's not the most important thing. And so classical Christian education reframes that very thing, going all the way back to what Christie said of what is most important. And it helps you think about what's most important as the glory of God and also loving my neighbor. And you have to order your loves. So who are your most immediate neighbors that you owe the most love and honor and respect to? It's your very own family, your very own community members, the people who live right next to you, your church members, the people who go to your school, the people who live in your county and then your state, and you work out from there. You have national shared history, even with someone that lives 3,000 miles away, but who still lives in your nation versus someone who lives in another country, and on and on. So classical Christian education helps us think in a pietistic way and helps us think in a way that we would love and honor our neighbors in a way that command gets totally twisted and seen in a totally different way when you go through a progressive secular education way, when you're just thinking about, you think more in terms of economy, and like more money is how you help more people, even if those people are far away. And so it's a totally different way of life that you've passed on.
Yeah, I was just going to say the idea of thinking through piety in terms of concentric circles. You mentioned, why do I care about my countrymen more than the countrymen of another country? But I think we're very concerned about what happens in Great Britain because they're still Westerners. Now, those are many concentric
That's where
circles.
the vast majority of us came from.
Absolutely. And so I don't have an obligation to the people in Scotland before the people of Cookville or of our county where we live. But at some point, I do care very much about them because I care about the West because I'm a Westerner and I understand what that means. And I understand it means a lot what happens in Great Britain to me and to my people here. I understand those relationships because I've understood history from a logic perspective, right? Going back to the trivium. And Jeff, to address, the idea of fifth commandment, if we think about social ills or social status today in our country, I've said this many times, we've talked about this, that you really, not to oversimplify, but you could really categorize the social ills of our day by saying it's all a fifth commandment violation. And we don't know who we are and we hate our fathers. Right? Whether we're talking, immediate fathers, which is largely true. We're talking about authorities over us, church authorities, those kinds of fathers, church fathers, the fathers of our country, right? You just think real practically taking down statues, changing who we should study or how we should study in the history classes because we hate who we are. And then again, thinking do we know who we are? We lack a grammar understanding of that as well. And when you look at these, shenanigans going on at universities, what you say is we have a lot of daddy issues going on. We have fifth commandment violations.
Well, and then to go back to the neighbor idea, I think that's one of the things that a lot of factors that led me here, but CCE was part of that, is that the neighbor I'm called to love is also my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. That they had goals and ambitions for their family and coming generations. I'm not a self-emerging project that is supposed to just treat my world as unformed, but I'm the continuity of something that was good before me. And I get it. There's, you may have been converted out of a family line of great degeneracy, but for those of us who have been handed good things, we have an obligation to the neighbor who tried to set us up well, right? And to continue the thing that they had begun. And that, in that fifth commandment sense, extends that, as a son of the Reformation, even as a Baptist, Martin Luther is a kind of father to me. I have certain obligations to him because of the good that he in history did that came down to me. William Kiffin is an English Baptist. Robert E. Lee as a figure in my particular part of the country, in my region. I have an obligation to these people. I'm not disconnected from them. Sometime in my past, I worked at a church that felt very hamstrung because they had a cemetery on the grounds. And there was a lot of bemoaning about that. And I eventually met a wiser Christian who said the reason that so many churches have graveyards is because they saw some of the churches outside the building in those graves and some inside the building worshiping the Lord now, but they were a body of continuity. And that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about with classical.
A local cloud of witnesses just outside.
Absolutely.
That's so good.
Exactly. And so CCE is self-conscious about this and says, hey, Aristotle may not meet me in New Jerusalem, but the Lord used him to produce some really good things. And we have an obligation to carry that forward. And Virgil and, you name the list. Then you eventually, as it goes from Athens to Rome to Jerusalem, where Christ, apostles proclaim the gospel. Now I get into a whole bunch of Christians who are making the best use of what God surfaced through the pagans and self-consciously deploying it to Christ's glory. That has an obligation upon me that's going to constrain my individual choices.
I think the image of Aeneas carrying his father out of the burning city of Troy is really, really rich. But he also has in his hand his little boy. Right. And so you have, it's just a beautiful image of these things that we're talking about. You have, and of course, Aeneas is, his whole mission is to carry his home, including his gods and his people, to a new place where, of course, they can flourish and continue. And so it's very generational. And of course, because of our day, we tend to think in terms of who am I as an individual? What plan, what's the verse in Jeremiah? God has plans for me. But we just think about me as an individual, like I just woke up on the planet entirely by myself. I think I got this stuff in youth group, right? Like, what is God's plan just for me? And never really being asked to think, what's your duty? What's your responsibility? In what ways do you owe God who made you, your parents who raised you, your forefathers, and thinking through that in lots of ways, but your forefathers who came before you, what is your duty to them? And only when you understand that can you look to the future and say, now, what is my duty to my own children, to the children of my neighbors? I just think about people who've started schools here, people involved in a local school. What is the duty to the children of my neighbors? And then how do we think, do all of those things in light of having grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren?
Well, and I won't keep us here forever, but, as you're thinking through this, think about the phenomenon that is so aberrant in history that we see all around us of intentional childlessness, where an individual says, I won't have children, I won't reproduce.
Yeah, it's a Fifth Commandment violation.
It's Fifth Commandment. And you think about the sacrifices that their grandparents made. Maybe, you just think about history. Western history to some degree, wherever you came from. They survived famines. They flee war. They worked multiple jobs to provide. They gave so much to the line that produced you. And then you, as this radically autonomous individual, says, I will lop the line off here. That, in some ways, is Western culture in our day. We'll just lop the line off right here.
And again, yeah. I know I keep going to literature, but it's just what I'm neck deep in most of the time right now with my classes. Today, I taught the students the difference between a comedy and a tragedy. A comedy ends with a marriage, right? There are children. There's a hope for a future. It's not about, I'm happy and in love with this person. We think about marriage in too narrow of a way. That could be part of it, sure. But it's not about you and your love for this other person. It's about the future, right? There's a bright future. A tragedy is when there's no death and resurrection, like for the hero. It's when there is only death. Right? There's no hope for the future. And so we are pursuing tragedy as a nation, as a people. Yeah. And we're thinking about how to train children to think about not just what can they do, which is important, right? We have to do something with our time. But one way to think about classical Christian education is we're teaching children how to be, right? That enculturation, that paideia. What kind of person do I want my child to be? And that doesn't matter if there are no children. Right. If there is no future, it assumes that there has to be a future.
And what kind of children do I want my great-great-grandchildren to be?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you're the link in the chain. The Fifth Commandment works both ways. So we've kind of been talking about this. You're honoring all those who have came before so that you can pass on that way of life to your inferiors, right? To the next generation in hopes that they will do the same. And we do this as humans, but it is the Lord who has taught us this. And it is the Lord who has not only explicitly taught us this in his commands, he also modeled this by being faithful even to his own people when they were unfaithful, right? So I've been reading through 1st and 2nd Kings with the boys and with my boys at home, and they're just always devastated every time there's a new king. Because I'll say, and so became king, and he did, and they'll go evil in the sight of the Lord, because it's almost always evil in the sight of the Lord. And then they get to the end of that king's time, and it says he dies, and then it'll say something about why the Lord didn't punish them. And last night we were reading, and it says, but the Lord did not punish them because of his love for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Earlier in a couple chapters back, after the death of another king, it said, but the Lord didn't punish them because of his promise to King David. And the thing I talked about with the boys is what are those promises? And they were able to deduce just through questioning themselves, trying to teach them classically, that it's the same promise. It's just a different aspect of the same promise, that God promised that he would do something through Abraham, that he would bless the entire world, all the nations, and that he promised King David that he would have a son who would always sit on the throne. And so he was faithful. He is generationally faithful, even when we are generationally unfaithful. And so he is the one who has been faithful, and he is the one who teaches us how to do that too, how to be faithful to those who have came before. It's why all of the Old Testament is full of God saying, remember, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, obey my commands. It's like, I have saved you. Therefore, worship me, therefore obey my commands, therefore love me. And it's the same story all the way through. And there was a promise that son would come and that all the nations would be blessed. And then Christ has come and he has done that and continues to do that. He continues to bless the nations, and Christ is the Son who will sit on the throne forever. And so classical Christian education is about recognizing that and about saying, okay, we're not God. We can't be generationally faithful in that way. We are not redeemers in the sense, obviously, of cosmic redemption that Christ is. But how can we be like him and showing that kind of love and generational faithfulness?
Well, and I would stake out here again, just trying to use helpful contrast. So I had a buddy who he's a faithful churchman, great guy. He lives in a different part of Tennessee, and he said, give me a call. I want to talk to you about starting a Christian school. Not necessarily classical, but a Christian school. And brother, if you're listening, you're about to find out what I'm going to talk to you about. This is why I've kind of locked in on CCE and CCE alone, because I recognize a lot of good has been done through what we would call traditional Christian education. But we're not striving for like, okay, what's some good we can get? We want the best. We want the best for our families. We want the best for our communities. We want the best for our churches. What's good enough isn't good enough, right? And I hope the listener in this conversation is hearing how CCE pushes you to this deep, immersive, comprehensive vision of Christ over all and Christ in all. So the contrast I would make, if you're saying, well, okay, I get why you prefer this to progressive education. I also prefer this to a Christian school that kind of treats each subject autonomously, then has a Bible class as part of the curriculum. Because for CCE, you can't understand anything apart from Christ. The reason arithmetic works is because Christ is Lord and orders his creation. And it's supposed to do something to serve his kingdom. And so it's not this like additional optional accessory that you can lay onto the curriculum map, but every subject is suffused with Christ. You know, we talk about him as the deepest root of truth and the highest expression of it. And that holds true for virtue, that holds true for beauty. And so CCE, done as a Christian project, pushes you to say everything can only be understood in light of Christ. And if you're not doing it that way, you're actually not interfacing with reality, because this is how reality is constructed. It's for Christ, it's through Christ, it's in Christ's kingdom, it's his reign. And if you're not going at it from that angle, you're missing the most substantial part of the education.
Yeah, it's still tainted by all of the worst parts of the progressive education that we talked about.
You're talking about the kind of Christian school that like has Bible
correct.
as a class.
That model that just kind of tacks Bible on. I mean, it's better than government school. Sure. You know, I think we all would admit and agree to that. But it's just not. It's not as robust as it should be. So when you're learning math in a school like that, if you're still not learning 1 + 1 = 2 is a valuable thing to know, because that is how God has spoke his world into existence, and those are the laws by which his world works. And learning that math is to glorify him. Then you will learn that math for some other end, and that other end might be, well, you know, I'm going to end up being a carpenter one day, or an engineer or something, and you'll still learn the math and you'll still be able to build things and they'll still be structurally sound, but you're still using the tools that God has given you to work with. And so what classical Christian education does is helps you understand not only the math and how to build things, but what should I be building and why should I be building it and who should I be building it for? What purpose should it serve? And so there are many people who have built things that are evil by using the same math. And then there are people who have built things that are lovely and beautiful and glorious, who have understood why they should be building in the first place. And so it's the telos of who you are also translates into the telos of the outworking of your hands once you start actually, you know, doing various sorts of work or vocation.
Well, and I'd go back to something Terry said about way earlier in the episode. Is STEM part of classical Christian education, right? And we tend to think broadly of STEM as technology development and utilization, right? And Terry, maybe I'll just let you talk about this more, if I can cue you up the way I wanted to with Nick. You raised the point that nobody knows phone numbers because we have cell phones, right? And y'all tell me, was it Aristotle who didn't like books because it would ruin everything?
Socrates.
Socrates
You
wouldn't.
can't have a conversation with a book any more than you can have a conversation with a statue. So he didn't write anything down because
he thought if we started writing stuff down, we'd never be able to remember anything.
Yeah, and I'm probably more Luddite than I've ever been,
He
but
was
we're
right.
probably not quite that Luddite, right? We're very thankful for books. We spend a lot of time with books. But Terry, to the point about STEM, you have to have a human being who, one, knows what a tool is for, what liabilities and what strengths it brings to you. So you think about a world that right now is either terrified or idolatrously in love with AI. What kind of human being do you want to create that knows what to do with artificial intelligence? So it's not that we're anti-tool. It's that we recognize tools take certain options off the table and they put certain options back on the table. These are the kind of people we want handling the tools.
Yeah. I need somebody who can think about what the tool is for and to what end it should be used.
And also what dangers
Yeah.
that tool brings.
Yeah,
to the
all new
table.
technology is inherently double-edged, right? Like we kind of sometimes joke about how the internet should just be shut down, right? Because it's just a cesspool.
Seconded.
And yet here we are, right,
Yeah, right.
with a podcast that most people will probably reach via the internet. And we use it all the time to stay in contact with loved ones, to find good information that is about true things. We use it as a resource for teaching. And so there are good things that come from phones, computers, internet, those kinds of things. And we bemoan the negative influences of those things, but also that's because humans are involved, right? So AI will be like this. It's just going to be like every other technology in that way, where it can be used for great good, it can be used for great evil. And I want somebody, before I even train somebody on how to use this tool, I need somebody who can recognize evil when they see it and know how to avoid it and has their loves properly ordered, so that when
And
they're
understands
using a
humans
tool,
who would be impacted by it, right?
Yes, and that they can use a tool to extend their skill and usefulness towards a good end, a truly good end.
I was trying to find a recent social media post by Elon Musk, who I do not think was classically educated, although I don't know, and I do not know that he was a Christian. But
I don't
I
think
would
he is.
suspect not.
Yeah.
He says he respects the teachings of Christ.
Sure.
But I have not seen him respect
Yeah,
the teaching that Christ must be, your sins must be repented and he must be confessed as Lord.
So I don't hold him up as a model.
Haven't seen
but,
the fruit of that in his life thus far.
Right.
Well, we're talking about
But
tech, right? So
we're
this is a
talking about
guy
tech,
that has,
which is why I bring him up.
This is
So
relevant. Mhm.
He reposted, in case you guys weren't listening, he says, he kind of reposts something where he says AI is going to be bringing in an age of great wealth. I'm sure you guys have read him on this subject. There's going to be healthcare like you've never seen before. There's going to be all these things available. Humanity will never have seen wealth like this ever, ever, ever. Super optimistic. And of course, I read that and I'm like, I don't know. But at the end, and he said this in many different ways, I'm sure, but at the end of this particular post, he said, but this is only true if Grok, his particular AI, if Grok is trained on truth, beauty, and goodness. And I was like, he gets it.
Somebody's talking to him. Yeah.
Somebody's talking to him. Contrast that with Sam Altman. Thank you. Different.
Sam Albury's a different kind of problem.
Different kind of guy.
It's a different contrast.
In a kind of a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, he's talking all about ChatGPT and all the capabilities. And Tucker's like, what about some basic ethics? And he's like, I hadn't thought about it.
Literally had no category. It was just.
And he's like, okay. And
silence.
Tucker keeps like breaking it down in these like smaller bites. He's like, so basically, is it good or could it ever be bad? And Altman's like, I'm just not a philosopher. I don't know. And I'm thinking this guy is leading the tech front, one of the guys leading the tech front for our people. And he doesn't understand that he should be thinking about ethics or philosophy. Just for him, it was like, I just hadn't thought about it.
Right and wrong or irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean,
I wish
his
he would have
answer was
at least-
basically like, well, we told it to stop telling people how to commit suicide.
Yeah.
But they probably wouldn't have done that if somebody hadn't bothered them about it.
Right.
Well, so I'll give another illustration just if listeners want to think about this practically. One of the concurrent factors with AI is the idea that humanity is basically going to be displaced from any meaningful vocation. Somebody's got to work to subdue the earth. So what we'll need to do is provide them a universal basic income, and that way they can still have purchasing power. The economy will keep moving or whatever. Well, you need someone, and I don't mean to indicate that I've settled this, but you need someone who knows humanity, the kind of person who knows humanity through a CCE education, to say, well, but humans are made to work. What happens to the human who's permanently put on the bench and unable to make a meaningful impact on their world? Is that survivable for humans? So it may sound great for you to get X number of dollars from the government so you can buy the next PlayStation generation and use your time completely on leisure. But is that actually survivable for humans? And I mean, I have my conclusions and my suspicions on that, but you need somebody asking those kind of questions of the tools and the strategies that are being birthed in this moment in history.
And that gets back to the original three questions, right?
Yep.
Who am I? Why am I here? Those kinds of philosophical questions. And if you know answers to those, or if you know how to ponder those things with meaning, you probably are going to have an opinion on that question.
Sure.
Right?
One of the tenets of classical Christian education is this integration of subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot answer those questions without a firm grasp of how these subjects are interrelated and dependent. And then, of course, you cannot act in society for the good of yourself and
Right.
for your neighbor.
Right.
Thinking real practically about AI, like you cannot do that without integrating. That's how you get this guy like Sam Altman saying, I don't know, I'm just a tech guy, I'm not the philosopher. He's
Yes.
not had two thoughts about ethics.
Yeah,
And that's
so
a travesty.
That's where my mind went to, Christie. The command to love your neighbor and love your Lord. Those can't be meaningfully pursued without those three fundamental questions you raised earlier. And you also have to remember that the command to love others is to love yourself, to love them as you love yourself. Well, what does it mean for me to love myself? In what way do I know myself? And what is my telos in the universe? You can't practice basic Christianity without being pushed to these, what we would call the great questions, the questions that humanity's wrestled with, forever. It's part of the reason we study the literature we do. We call it the great tradition because they're wrestling with these ideas. But, if you were going to be like, let's just boil down Christianity to essential moral commands. Love neighbor, love God. Well, immediately, I'm supposed to love my neighbor according to what definition of love? Give them whatever they want and whatever they think feels good in the moment? Or is there some kind of higher standard that we all conform to that we can thrive in? What does it mean to love them as I love myself? Particularly if I'm self-loathing in the way you're talking about with our culture where we tear down our fathers. I mean, nuts and bolts Christianity can't be pursued without something like this inquiry of these questions. And I think it's really helpful for students to be put into an environment that's self-consciously going, okay, we're going to spend our time thinking about this in their formative years.
Let me shift gears if I can, because this has all been very good. And from the outside looking in, a person looking at a classical Christian school is going to see some idiosyncrasies, right? So let's talk about a couple of those. We'll start with this one. Why are they all doing Latin or Greek? Some of them do Greek. What are we doing here? Like, why aren't we teaching Spanish or Chinese or computer coding?
I'm going to queue up one of you guys
Latin?
for that.
I have the sarcastic answer,
Send
which
it.
is that
Hurt children.
where I actually was talking to a mom recently about this and raising up middle schoolers. I said, you have to contrive. In our world, we're so wealthy. We have so many technological advances that we have to contrive ways for our children to be miserable. So that's that's my pithy answer.
That's it.
No, somebody step in and do better than that.
It's not working at my house because my boy does the pick the dick the Latin and he loves it.
He loves
Well, that must be nice.
Yeah,
He just does it for fun.
yeah, he does.
Do you want me to?
Wait, that's an
Yeah.
option? My kids have not been told that's an option.
Yeah, that is an option.
I mean, can I suggest the fifth commandment again?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
That it's
This is a
the-
reason.
It's
right?
the mother tongue.
That's what I would say.
It's who we are.
Yeah, much of our civilization has been passed down from Rome, which obviously Rome had lots of problems from a Christian perspective, but we have derived a lot of our understanding of justice, order, society, our definition for piety. It was extremely important to the Romans. I mean, you could translate it almost as duty. They're almost interchangeable in the Roman mind. And so, yeah, it's our mother tongue. This was also the lingua franca for generations. Where classical universities existed in Europe, you may travel to one. You may be from England. You may travel to France and go to a classical university, but you knew you were going to be fine because everybody spoke Latin. Their native tongue may be German or Romanian or whatever it is, but everybody knows Latin, and this is how they were educated. And in the old days, before the advent of modern progressive education, the subjects that were taught were mathematics, Greek, and Latin, and the reason was because all of the great works of literature wherein the other disciplines were found were written in Greek and Latin, and so you needed those subjects not just for their own right, which they are of value in their own right, but also so that you could access the great tradition. So that's a reason as well, and it's kind of connected to what you're talking about. Another one,
Lewis says that the reason to study Latin is that you get the opportunity to read the Latin poets.
Yeah. And you could say Greek is the same. Well, Greek is less common. I think Greek, finding somebody who knows actual Attic Greek or classical Greek is there's a lot of people running around that know Koine because that's what the New Testament was written in. And it's a little different, but that would also be worth pursuing. But Latin is the more common one. Now, another one, I was just having a conversation earlier with our Latin teacher about a particular example of Roman orderliness of thought that appears in their language. And he was talking about a particular grammar construction that Latin has an ability to very clearly articulate. And the English equivalent, which is very ambiguous and hard to understand, we have to use 20 words where the Romans have like one preposition to accomplish the same thing. So there's an orderliness to the thoughts of the Roman mind that probably contributed to the development of the language, and then the two probably fed each other, right? The way that when they learned to speak, it also helped shape their thinking.
It came out in their architecture.
Right. And their thoughts of society, like these things that we're talking about adopting and bringing along from their civilization. Another reason why Latin can be used is because it teaches the tools needed to learn language in a general sense, right? So I often find myself, when discussing Latin with students, thinking, all right, well, what's the English version of this? Like, do you know what a direct object is? That's where you start, and you say, okay, here's how you do this in Latin. But it increases and enhances their ability to use their own native tongue. And then they can carry these tools into really any language they want, because human beings communicate the same kind of concepts to each other, regardless of language. And now you've got the tools to study any language you want.
And many of the languages are based on Latin.
Sure, yeah.
The Romance
So
languages.
that's the practicality in me.
Yeah. Well, and Terry, if I could kind of piggyback on your idiosyncrasy point there. And again, I just need to qualify that not every opinion I say reflects everybody else in the room. But hopefully the listener's like, oh yeah, CCE sounds great. I'm interested in that, right? Well, that's been happening now for several decades. Mm-hmm. It's become fashionable. It's trendy. Yeah. There's a CCE proponent serving in the current administration with their president.
Right.
And so one of the things I would tell someone who's like had their appetite whetted for this is that it's become trendy enough to be counterfeited.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And if you're inquiring and wanting to find what we're talking about, the idiosyncrasies are your way to find the authentic. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to have CCE schools that think they're CCE because they read the Aeneid, right? But what you're looking for, listener, is a school that's unapologetic about Latin education, unapologetic about academic rigor, unapologetic about reading dead white guys, unapologetic about the things that make us distinct as a classical school, and not the school that is saying, let's throw away any of that that's unpalatable to our market constituency. Let's make this as stylized to their preferences as possible. I don't want to sound elitist on this, but we offer a very specific kind of thing, and it has to be offered according to its nature. To modify it is often to lose it. It's not unlike the gospel. When you say the gospel plus something, you end up with something less than the gospel. CCE is not nearly as important as the gospel. But when you start stylizing CCE, you start losing it.
Yeah, it's not elitist, it's faithfulness.
That's well said.
It's faithfulness to tradition, it's faithfulness to Again, it's all about the fifth commandment, boys. It's faithfulness to those that came before us. That's exactly the answer I would have given for Latin. Ultimately, Latin is a great way, a great means to grow in wisdom and virtue. But why is it a great
and access beauty, right?
And access beauty, writings. And why is it a means to those things? Well, it's because as Americans, as English speakers, if English is your father, then Latin is your mother. And so it's to not know Latin, we are a generation of people that do not know Latin well. Some of us have taught it at a rudimentary level, but I want my sons to know it robustly because I want them to not only know their father but also their mother. And to think about language just a little bit more. We started by talking about paideia and how there's not a great English translation for it. Ancient languages are that way. They give us access to words that we can't even articulate in our own language, which therefore gives you access to thoughts and to wisdom that you cannot even access in your own language because you can't think of it in your language because you think in your language. You think thoughts using the words that you know. And so when you have access to Latin or to biblical Hebrew, to biblical Greek, you can think about the scriptures, you can think about those that have come before you and the thoughts that they have had in ways that you couldn't otherwise.
Can I suggest a metaphor? Like me a good metaphor?
Can you make a metaphor out of that?
A few years ago, we planted a bunch of blueberry bushes in our yard. I think a few raspberry bushes were involved at some point. And the thing about planting a berry bush, and this might be true for all fruit, I don't know about that, but for the first few years, we had to pick the fruit off before it matured. And the idea is that we're pushing the energy of this plant into the root system so that it would be strong. And so I was excited about blueberries, excited about raspberries, but for 2 to 3 years, we had to, pick the fruit off and we couldn't let it really fruit. And what classical Christian education is it's an education of roots, right? As we talk about the fifth commandment, but it's also an education that requires roots and values roots, which means, and I could probably expand this in lots of ways. But as we think about something like Latin, and I know I've heard parents say, well, it's not really practical. And it's so much like those bushes where we say, it doesn't seem practical yet. But this year, I think we put up like 40 quart bags of blueberries in the freezer.
Yeah, we didn't plant acres of these.
No,
plants.
we have like 6 bushes, and they're still just starting to to fruit well, and so it didn't seem really practical at first to pick off all the berries, but what we wanted was really, really strong roots. And so studying something like Latin is establishing roots for our children in their own learning and their own thinking, but also just thinking about what it means to be a Westerner. It's going to the roots of who we are as a people. And again, I could probably expand that into some other ways when we think about reading instruction or cursive or lots of other areas.
Having a baby, not very practically beneficial for the first several years of its life. It's a long-term project.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
As someone in the room who deeply identifies with Ernest T. Bass, all this sounds really good. How do I know that it works? What proof is it that it works?
So the biggest association of classical schools, there's a couple of different groups kind of working on this, but the ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, has done significant amount of empirical research on outcomes, right? Outcomes for classical students compared with, let's see if I can, so homeschool students, Catholic school, evangelical college prep, public school. And there may be one other one, but they put this out. It was called the Good Soil Study, and I can't remember when it was conducted, but I want to say that the actual data was released around 2019 or so.
That's right, 2018,
yeah. So we just got a few minutes left, but Christie, do you want to give us some interesting anecdotes from that study? First of all, is this available for interested parties to just find?
It is. It is available on the website. The ACCS website, Association of Classical Christian Schools.
Right. I think it's classicalchristian.org.
Right. And you're looking for resources, and then it's called the Good Soil Study. And so I'll see if I can.
Cardis did this study for them.
That's right.
Yeah.
known for studying educational outcomes. So here's one. This is, real basic, but I think parents still want to know, like, can my kid go to college if they don't have 2 years of Spanish in high school?
Yeah.
And so, if we're looking at those different groups, homeschool, evangelical schools, Catholic schools, college prep schools, and public schools, I'll pull a few specifics. I could talk about generalities, but I think the specifics are really helpful to illustrate the fact that classical Christian education is very effective in lots of ways. We're talking about making virtuous human beings, but also but can they go to college? So these students were asked, these were alumni, these students were asked if they were well prepared for college by their high school. And the lowest there, coming in under 50%, was public schools. The second highest is about, I'm looking at maybe 75% was Catholic schools. And then just under 90% of the ACCS alum. So ACCS is just a particular association that does not include all classical schools, but the study was just trying to single out the efficacy of ACCS schools. And almost 90% of those students said they were well prepared for college by their high schools. Again, the second was coming in closer to 75%.
So it's a pretty big jump.
It's a very big jump. And then this study, if you want to look into it, breaks down who earned A's or mostly A's in their college, who earned a B or higher. Who earned a bachelor's or higher in college, ACCS grads, over and above their counterparts, who felt well prepared. It's one thing to be prepared. And we've seen studies on American public school students often feel very well prepared, but score lower than most other developed countries. So it's how prepared are you, but then also how do you feel prepared? And those things are actually matching for ACCS students. Okay. Let's talk about life, though. We talked about classical education is really an education.
Yeah, this study is very comprehensive.
Very comprehensive.
A lot of outcomes were measured here, and among other things, there were life activities. What are you? Are they in church? What is their family life like? Yeah, are they participating in public life? These kinds of things. So go ahead.
Yeah, and those 7 outcome profiles, by the way, are college and career, life outlook, Christian commitment, Christian lifestyle, traditional and conservative, independence of mind, which I think is, some people might be surprised that they're, aren't you indoctrinating students? You don't want them to be independent. We actually want them to be independent of certain influences like popular culture, right? Not independent of scripture, but we do want a certain kind of independence of mind, and then influence. And then it also assess school experience, like did the kids enjoy it?
Yeah,
did they make friends? Did they have a good time? Which I think is of some value, certainly. So let me try to keep scrolling this very long document. Here's an interesting one. Okay. ACCS graduates, do they trust people around them, indicating a positive outlook on life? So are we graduating cynics? Are these people cynical about the world? Have they learned to be hyper critical? What does that look like? Do they trust the people around them? When it comes to strangers, coworkers, people at church, and their neighbors, they exceed all of their counterparts. Every single metric on this question exceeds their counterparts. They trust their coworkers. The margin between those other kinds of education is greatest when it comes to coworkers and strangers, which I thought was really, really interesting. So, kids who are discipled well are trusting strangers more than children who were given any other kind of education. I don't know if I'm communicating that.
It doesn't mean naivety. It means that they're the bedrock of a high-trust society, which we're all feeling the loss of.
Right. Okay, who do you think trusts scientists? Now, we're just talking about trusting institutions and outsiders. Who do you think is trusting scientists? Catholics, public school, homeschool? What would you... I think most of you probably know all the outcomes, so you don't have an honest guess.
Well, if I was trying to be objective, I would guess that public school students would trust scientists most. Is that accurate?
No, it's ACCS students.
How about that? Okay.
Yeah. So if you think about, are we teaching our kids to hate science and just put their heads in the mud?
To be intellectual checkouts.
absolutely. No, we're actually teaching our students how to think well, and that good scientists should be trusted, but they understand to ask that question and to how to define it. Let me find another metric.
So in other words, a potential accusation against ACCS that we're anti-science, like we don't respect scientific pursuit, appears to be unfounded.
Entirely unfounded.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. Let's see. Trying to find there.
While you're looking for that, an interesting anecdote about the study is that when it came out, the ACCS was a little reluctant to release the information, and there was initial concern that the numbers were not going to be impressive. And it turned out that they were reluctant to release it because it appeared that they cheated, because the outcomes for the ACCS schools were so strong. Now, this was carried out by an independent agency that the ACCS employed to measure these things. So the ACCS did not manipulate the data. But I found that to be interesting, that they were like, oh, goodness, it's so overwhelmingly positive in most categories that it almost seems faked. So it really is worth it to look at if classical Christian, if you're involved in it now, or if you are considering it, this is something to look at. And again, this is ACCS schools, which are all classical, but they do not represent all classical schools. And the outcomes are maybe similar for other classical schools. We don't know for sure, but it's likely that there's some carryover there.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the anecdotes that Chrissy highlighted for me a while back that I find interesting pastorally, I think the idea that we're anti-science comes from this idea that somehow Christians are anti-intellectual. We're terrified of Darwin. Our faith can only survive in intellectual sheltering. Another one of those is that we become kind of religious snobs and look down and have no meaningful connections to the world that's lost. And one of the things the ACCS students scored on very high is that they have meaningful friendships with homosexuals. Mm-hmm. And so they're still interfacing with a world that has a very different value system than we do, but they are interfacing with that world in a way that they can say, well, actually, we're very, despite the disparities in
they're
our
not
convictions.
Monks, they're not running off to hide.
Right, we're not hiding, we're not being, religiously hateful in whatever way that might be assumed to be, but we're actually engaging with the world as we meet it.
Yeah, they're in the world, but they're also not of it, because the outcomes
I feel like I read that somewhere.
Yeah, you read that somewhere.
Christy, give us one more.
The outcomes of that study also say, even though they're in it, that they're living more faithfully to their faith.
I want to say in that same section on the friendships with homosexuals that they were also much more likely to vocally express disapproval of homosexuality as a lifestyle and call it as sin.
Right. The data says these are the kids who are showing up to church every Sunday. These are the kids who are, in their workplace, making a dent professionally and personally. So
give us one more good one. We gotta sign off here
many,
soon.
Yeah. This one says ACCS alumni defy categories as they retain orthodoxy and engage the world, which is kind of what you guys were saying. And so this is not just one particular question, but sort of a summary of this section. But it says it assessed independent views, reading science, willing to disagree, accept differences, but willing to challenge. Again, using multiple questions. And again, ACCS alumni far outpace homeschool, evangelical, Catholic, private prep, and public school peers. Okay, this one's interesting. I don't know if it's the most important, but again, just trying to. Right. Yeah.
Again, you can find this on your own, and because it's worth reading and looking at.
Study.
Absolutely. Yeah. Obligation to care for the environment. That one's again not the most important thing, but I think again goes against.
But this would be another one where I'd say, well, surely public school kids, right? Because they're all told climate change and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
the ice caps are melting and will kill you tomorrow.
Florida's going to be underwater next week.
All right. Just over 52% of ACCS graduates feel that they have an obligation to care for the environment. Under that is coming in about 47% Catholic students, Catholic school students, and then 45% public.
Okay.
And so again, outpacing their peers when it comes to things like creation care. So it's a liberal arts education. It's not just we're reading. it's not just a humanities education.
Right.
It's not how to ignore science and only know the Bible. It's not just be a good Christian and you don't have to, here's one on total reading or reading non-religious books. Like it's how to be, how to be human. And, I think testing in this way is one data point, or in this case, many data points. But also talk to students who are in a classical school, talk to graduates, talk to their parents. If you have access to those kinds of people, tour a school, sit in a classroom.
Yeah, find one close to you and call them. They'll be happy to give you a tour.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this stuff tells us the things that we hoped would be true. The study seems to prove that, but also go and look for yourself.
Yeah.
That's the classical way. So go to the source, evaluate it, ask questions.
To go back, I know we need to wrap up, but to go back to the question that you asked, Jason, about how do you know that this works? And all of the Cardis study is excellent. I encourage everybody who's listening, if you haven't read it, to go read it. But as Americans who very much love the roots of our states and of our nation, and we think about all of the good things that I think most of us realize is evaporating pretty quickly. Well, why is that? Why was there so much rootedness and fruit and goodness and beauty at the founding, and why over the last 250 years has it faded away? Well, if you go back and look at the way everybody was educated in colonial America, and in the first 100 years of the country before that 40-year gap, 1880 to 1920, when was the last time there was a 2 or 3 generation, in a row that gave you people like John Winthrop and George Washington and
John
Sevier, Tennessean, and Patrick Henry and William Bradford.
Even someone who's not like we would call an Orthodox Christian, but a Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. Wouldn't we love it if all the secularists were Thomas Jeffersons, if that was like as worse as it got, or Benjamin Franklin. Men like Jonathan Edwards, theologians like Jonathan Edwards or R.L. Dabney or Thornwell. Those sorts of people don't exist in mass like they existed in mass from, let's call it 1650 to 1850, like the first 200 years that that European peoples came here and the way they were all educated. And the amount of thinkers that existed at that time who weren't just thinkers, but who ordered all these things that we're talking about, ordered all of their thoughts and their affections, their civic life and everything to pursued virtue.
Pursuing wisdom and virtue for the glory of God and for the good of their neighbor. And also women who were helps to their husbands like Abigail Adams. Like Abigail Adams was incredibly educated and wise lady, and she spent her time raising her children, and they went on to be pretty incredible. And John Adams was not there. I mean, he was gone, doing Revolutionary War things and being a statesman and being an ambassador to England. And I think he was the first ambassador to England for America. And so he was not home often at all. And so Abigail Adams raised all those kids, and you go look at the fruit of the Adams children. And so for people who think that motherhood's not important, right, to think about how classical Christian education speaks to all of who we are. You want your wives and your mothers to be like that. And you want the theologians and the statesmen to be like those men. And so the Cardis study is excellent as far as what the modern movement is doing, but that modern movement is trying to recover what those people had in mass. When people were educated, colonial America and early America, first few generations, this is how they were educated. That's why we live in the greatest country that has existed up to this point.
Yep.
And if I can say one last thing, I don't know, maybe it was Jeff who commented on classical Christian education is weird. I don't know if you use that word.
I've used it often.
You have used it often. It's weird, and it creates conflict in lots of ways. And so I think one more way that I want to put on the listeners' radar to think about what is CCE, what does it do for the students, it necessarily requires a very large dose of courage. And one of the ways I've started to talk and think about CCE is it's an education in courage. And I think that matters as well, because all of these, you think of all those men, they're not producing anything if it's not for courage, right? And so I think that's a really important part. I don't know that you're going to find that in Plato. Maybe. I don't know how important that was to the medievals who are creating the universities, but it is virtue and it is required. And I think that's, should be more part of the conversation, that we have to, we don't want children to be anti-authoritarian necessarily, but we need children who are prepared and equipped to do what is weird or difficult or creates conflict.
Because it's right.
Because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And was it Lewis that said that courage is the testing point of all the other virtues?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, before we sign off, we've got to make a nod to our friends at Bare Knuckle Gloves, who they've given us a couple samples. I'm still using mine. They're quite dirty now, but they're just as comfortable as they were when I got them, and they're holding up quite well. No problems. Jeff, are you still using yours?
Yeah, I'm using them every time I can get them away from my kids.
Oh man, they've been stolen.
They're trying to take them. One thing I've noticed is that's interesting to me. We go through a lot of leather gloves. Sam's has a collection that you can buy fairly affordably, and we've went through a gajillion of those. When I've been doing fencing projects with barbed wire, I almost always wear out the fingertips of the gloves working with barbed wire fencing. The bearskins have, to my eye, suffered no substantial damage as I've done that stuff. And they're just another bison hide.
That's right. Yeah, they're buffalo hide. They're, at least that's the ones they sent us. But they have a wide variety of different gloves, and so you should check them out. We have a discount code, Issachar, that you can put in at checkout. That helps the show, and it gets you a little bit of a discount there. And so take a look up Bare Knuckle Gloves and
buybareknuckles.com.
Yeah, buybareknuckles.com. That's bear the animal, BEAR. And one more shout out. This is not a sponsor of the show, but this is a company that sent us here at the school. They sent us a trauma kit, which is a kind of an emergency first aid kit for pretty serious injuries.
Those poor Latin students.
Yeah. It's this is a Christian company called Refuge Medical Training, and I highly recommend their products. I had a chance to look over this trauma kit, and I've owned a couple of trauma kits from just times in the past where I needed to have those kind of things, and so I'm excited to have this on the premises. We're hoping that it just gets to sit in the corner and not get used ever, but if we need it, we've got it. And so if you are in the market for that, if you want to know more about medical response, then Refuge will do trainings. They have lots of free videos. And if you're interested in getting yourself a pretty robust first aid kit that can handle very serious problems, then you should check them out. They're not paying us or anything like that, but we wanted to give them a shout out on the show because their kindness to just donate that to us. But you can find them at refugemedical.com. And their mission statement is to save lives while in service to the Father's kingdom and experiencing the abundance of his provision and blessings. So these are our people. So if you're in the market for that kind of thing, check them out at refugemedical.com.
Thank you guys for making time just to be with us today and lend some of your expertise and some of your wisdom to these subjects. I really think it's so important that people understand what we are dealing with in this day and age, what our society's having to endure, and what classical Christian education has to offer everyone. I'm going to post some more links to some articles in the comments. Be sure to check those out. We've got some great materials that have been put in front of me, so I just want to share those as well. The dads group at the Classical Christian School where my kids attend, they meet monthly and discuss current articles, and I'm excited for you to experience what we went over. So please be sure and check those out in the description section of the podcast. So I wanted to do a quick plug for Classical Christian Schools. They need your support. If you're looking for something to invest your resources into, that will make a difference. I don't think there is much nobler a cause than classical Christian education. I have seen firsthand the impact that it does make, and I can tell you that it is unlike any other schooling that I've ever experienced or been part of. So again, thank you for joining us. And until next time, we hope you strive as we do to be men and women of Issachar.